Do you want to wake up feeling like you're stepping into who you're meant to be, into the best possible version of you? What if I told you that the key to your best life, health, and happiness are all around you? You just have to find what works for you. I'm Hope Pedraza, and I believe that there isn't just one way to live a healthy and meaningful life, and that all you need is a little inspiration to make changes that last from the inside out. Each week, I'll be sharing tangible tips and inspirational interviews to help you on your journey. These are the steps to take to improve your life and live with purpose. This is Hopeful and Wholesome. Hey y'all, welcome back to the show. I am talking today about autoimmune disease, and we're talking about root cause. And I know if you're in my world, that's all we talk about is root cause. But I specifically want to talk about autoimmune diseases because it's been coming up a lot. I personally have a ton of clients that deal with autoimmune diseases. And I've been seeing some really interesting things pop up on social media from some other fellow FGNs and some other, functional practitioners in my world that I feel like is a really good conversation. And I saw one the other day, and I can't for the life remember who it was to be able to give her credit, but she was basically talking about how, the minute you're diagnosed with an autoimmune disease, it's like, oh, your body's attacking itself. And there's like this stigma of like, oh my gosh, like my body is completely and totally like rebelling against me and it hates me. And, and you feel this sense of like helplessness and like, well, crap, like, I guess this is my life now. And that's just not the case. Now, yes, I'm not saying it's easy for people living with autoimmune disease, but what I am saying is the way that it's portrayed by a lot of medical practitioners out there is like doom and gloom and like, well, your life is over or your life's going to suck from here on out. But there are alternatives to that. So I want to speak to that. I want to speak to exactly, because that's the other piece. And I've had, I've talked with clients about this too, because a lot of times when at least in my world, when I'm dealing with clients with autoimmune diseases, they have gone to so many doctors, so many practitioners to try to figure out what's going on. And a lot of times they're not diagnosed for years. Like they go through all these labs and testing and this and that and this and that, and they're not diagnosed for years. And there's some reasons for that, which I'll talk about in a second. But the point is, they're talking to me and they're like, what the heck caused this? Like, why am I dealing with this? Why is this happening to me? And again, I think that's the other piece of that. What I was talking about before is it's you feel, especially if your doctor is describing it to you like, oh, your body's attacking itself, then you're like, what the heck did I do to deserve this? Right. So I want to talk about the causes, and I think also it's helpful just in terms of like preventative care and kind of living making preemptive decisions to help prevent these things from happening. So let's talk about autoimmune diseases and what they are. So as of today, this day and age, there are over 100 known autoimmune conditions. And there's some that we hear about the most, right? We hear about type 1 diabetes, there's psoriasis, psoriatic arthritis, there's Hashimoto's and Graves' disease and celiac and multiple sclerosis and rheumatoid arthritis, Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis, or lupus. I think those are the ones we hear about the most, but there are over 100 of them. And again, I mentioned before how it can be really hard for people to get diagnosed. This is a lot, I think mostly because, or one of the big reasons, is because the symptoms really vary from person to person. Like somebody can have completely different symptoms of the same autoimmune disease. It just affects people differently. And they can come and go in frequency. So it's not like, people don't necessarily have these symptoms and flare-ups 24/7. It's like they come and go. And so it's hard to kind of catch things in the moment, like, oh yeah, this is exactly what it is. And they can look different each time they flare up. And the other piece of this, the symptoms can mimic those of other conditions, which is why it can be so hard to diagnose. The symptoms, especially when you're just looking symptomatically, gets really confusing because a lot of them have really similar symptoms. The other thing I think is important to mention here is that not all practicing physicians are equally skilled or trained to recognize these autoimmune diseases or run the appropriate diagnostics, like the appropriate labs to be able to diagnose this. And this is to no fault of their own, really. I think it's not their fault because most of them just weren't taught about it at length. Like the same thing with nutrition. I've talked about this before. doctors do what they're trained to do. This isn't bashing doctors. This isn't to say they don't know anything. Obviously they do. But this is to say that they just weren't trained that way. The same thing with nutrition. Like they're not giving you sound nutrition advice because they weren't trained in it. They're trained in dealing with symptoms. They're trained in dealing with medicine and surgeries and like acute situations. Like that's how they're trained. So point is, there are, specialists that have additional training in autoimmune diseases, like rheumatologists, right? These are the ones that are trained at length. So when I say not all doctors are trained in it, this is why you go to a specialist to deal with these things, because general practitioners just aren't trained to deal with this. And they just don't really know the right labs to run. And even when you go to a specialist, if you're going to a conventional medicine doctor, just, how do I say it? In the best way here. Again, I'm not telling you to go and get your doctor's orders at all. I never want to make it sound like that. But I think what I'm trying to say is just to take, their recommendation and diagnosis with a grain of salt, knowing that you can go get another opinion, right? You don't have to take their word as the God's honest truth, and this is the gospel, and this is what it is. You can go to other doctors, you can get other opinions. So moving on from there. I want to address this too, because this is kind of the piece I mentioned before about the immune system, right? Because you're thinking, okay, isn't your immune system supposed to be what protects you, right? It protects you from invaders and it protects you from disease and virus. Why would it betray me? And why would it, quote unquote, be attacking itself, right? That's usually what you hear. So this is a great question. And it is true that if you have an autoimmune disease or autoimmune condition, that your body is essentially damaging its own tissue. And this is what causes so many of the side effects, right? Like this debilitating fatigue and achy joints. Maybe you have rashes, things that show up on the outside, weight gain, all those things. Your body, key point here, key point. Your body is not betraying you, nor is it against you, nor is it revolting against you, nor is it out to get you. It's literally just trying to protect you. It's a protective mechanism. That's what it's trying to do. So the problem is that somewhere along the way, there's some confusion in your immune system. And so it's like the signal gets crossed, right? Like if you ever played with like walkie-talkies when you were a kid and all of a sudden you're hearing like somebody's phone conversation of your neighbor down the street. I don't know if that happened to you, but it happened to me as a kid. It's like this signal gets scrambled, right? And so there's some confusion going on in your immune system. And now your healthy tissue is kind of caught in this crossfire, right? Of this confusion, these signals that got scrambled. So the question remains, of course, right? Like, why did it get confused in the first place? And I think another important thing to ask is, because I've heard this before too, people use this as an excuse for like, oh, I can eat this because our grandparents ate this and it was totally fine. Here's another question, right? Why didn't our grandparents, or even maybe even our parents, seem to have these same problems in their youth, right? So there is clear evidence that there is a genetic component to this, but there is also an environmental component. And you can't say it's one or the other. You can't say that it's entirely driven by genetics or it's entirely driven by lifestyle, right? It's a combination of these things that's going to affect people differently. And with the way that we're exposed, which I'm getting ahead of myself, but the way that we're exposed to toxins and chemicals and stuff in food, processed food, like that our grandparents were not exposed to, that's a good reason why they didn't have the same level of autoimmunity that's happening today. So autoimmune disease affects about 23.5 million Americans. That's just the American statistic. It's obviously this is a global thing that's happening. And pretty much the Western world is dealing with this, like at an astronomical number. It's about 84%. Some studies say 80. So 80 to 84% of people living with autoimmune disorders are women. Okay. And typically they're women of childbearing age. Now, there are some theories behind this. Of course, none of this can be like explicitly proven by studies, but there are some theories about which all of them make total sense. So first is just gender differences in immunity, just in general. The female immune system, that's like brush our shoulders here, is more sophisticated than a man's. And so because the fact that we have to carry babies, like we're responsible for our immune system and we're responsible for this little human's immune system that we're carrying. So women naturally have stronger inflammatory responses than men do when their immune systems are triggered. And so inflammation is what plays a key role in, I mean, so many things in general, but especially autoimmune diseases, right? So it's our immune system is kind of like on hyper alert anyway. It's not saying your immune system is weaker. Again, it's a little more sophisticated because we have to not only worry about ourselves, but like any humans that we grow along the way, right? The other thing are sex hormones. This is a big one, and this is what most researchers think is really the key here, is that autoimmune diseases tend to like flare up around female hormonal fluctuations. And I cannot tell you, like almost every client that I have that has autoimmune issues, it is always around their cycle that things flare up. And there's a big, reason for this. Estrogen plays a huge part in this. And there's lots of studies and articles about estrogen related diseases. And that can be what kind of triggers a lot of things that happen, especially when we're talking about like excess estrogen. But it's really the fluctuation, right? There's so many hormonal fluctuations in a woman's life. You have your menstrual cycle, and you have pregnancy, and you have birth, and you have lactation, you have postpartum, and you have menopause, perimenopause, post. I mean, there's so many fluctuations. And so your hormones are like, all over the place throughout your life. And so, this can cause changes in your immune system and how your immune system responds to things as well. There is another piece of this. There's a genetic susceptibility piece that has to be mentioned because there's some evidence that shows that there's variations in the X chromosome can be related to certain autoimmune diseases. And since we've got them, we just have a higher risk, right? And then there's this other piece, some studies that show pregnancy can actually be, and actually I have had multiple clients that's when they found out, like that's when things started to flare up, was after, right, was postpartum. So there's a statistic, 44.3% of women who develop an autoimmune condition have onset of that condition after their first year of pregnancy. Again, a lot of researchers think this could be just because of these hormonal fluctuations and just kind of the stress. I mean, it's for all of you listening that have had kids, it's freaking stressful on your body. It is one of the biggest traumas to your body you could ever undergo. There's a lot going on. So the fact that there's so much stress on the body during that time can kind of leave you susceptible to that. And then there's this other piece, this called the T helper, the T cell. These cells are important in the immune response, especially during pregnancy. Again, we're responsible not just for us, but these little humans we're making, because these cells help your immune system as a human yourself and your baby protected, right? So you have to protect you and the baby, and that's what these little TH cells do. And so the changes in the TH cell immune response can drive the progression of certain conditions. There's some studies that show that. So there's a lot of like scientific reasons that women are more susceptible. But here's the other thing that I want to mention here. And I mentioned this in a post I did not too long ago, because you don't always look sick, quote unquote, look sick when you're dealing with autoimmune issues, right? You could look totally fine on the outside, healthy weight, healthy skin, healthy whatever. And so because of this, it can be misleading to people, and especially doctors. This is why I believe so many women get brushed off, is because you go in and you're like, you look totally fine. Your blood pressure is fine. I know all the markers. Your blood pressure is fine. You have a regular period, and your blood sugar, like they measure all the things, and you're like, no, really, something is wrong. And so I think because of this, because you don't necessarily look sick. Now, granted, there are some where, yes, you would have something going on the outside of your body. But I do think this is why a lot of women get brushed off, and we are so much more susceptible to this. And I think doctors just don't really understand that. So shifting gears to talk about the cause. So the exact cause is unknown. And you read studies that say that, and it's really just because there's not just one root cause. If you want to look at the three things that lead to autoimmune disease, you're looking at genetics, you're looking at the environment, and you're looking at gut health, i.e. intestinal permeability, i.e. leaky gut. Those are the three things, all right? And we're going to go deeper into those, but those are really the three things. It's genetics, it's the environment, and it's intestinal permeability. Intestinal permeability. That's what it is. So when you're going about things the conventional way, go to the doctor. The conventional approach to this, to autoimmunity, just in general, is basically to just suppress the overall immune response, right? You get on immunosuppressive drugs, and which makes sense, right? They're trained in managing symptoms. The way you manage symptom is like, hey, let's calm your immune system down. It's like hyper vigilant right now. Let's calm it down. So you take these immunosuppressive drugs. But here's the thing. You're not getting to the root cause, and you're not addressing what's actually causing the immune response in the first place. Not to mention, but I'm going to, that you are also increasing your risk of so many other health issues because you're basically partially shutting down your immune system. Like it's suppressing immunosuppressive drugs, or either it's suppressing your immune system. So it leaves you to susceptible to so many things. Now, I'm not saying there's not a time and place for drugs here and for medication, but I don't want you to think that's the only option because there are other options out there. Okay. So let's kind of dive deeper into some of these causes. So first, let's talk about food sensitivities. All right. So food sensitivities and leaky gut kind of go together in my book. We know, as you know by now, if you've been in my world for any length of time, about 80% of your body's immune system lives in your gut. So your immune system, your immune response is 100% going to be related to what you eat and how your gut is functioning. Okay. Now, food sensitivities cause a reaction in the body, causes inflammation in the body. Lots of inflammation in the body starts to cause your mucosal barrier, the lining of your gut, to become inflamed, and it makes little perforations in your gut, right? This is what causes leaky gut. That's like the simplified version of it, right? Permeability, meaning it's permeable. There's little holes in it. There's little tears, and it's from inflammation in the body, okay? So this is caused from stress, toxins, certain foods, infections. There's so many things, bacteria. So when this happens and you have these little perforations, you're allowing undigested foods to leak into your bloodstream, and especially undigested proteins. This is going to cause your body's like, alert, alert, alert. There's invaders in the bloodstream. There's undigested crap floating around. Like, what do we do? So your body sends out this immune response to like fight it off, right? It also prevents the absorption of a lot of vitamins and minerals. And so not only you have this like, foreign stuff floating around in your bloodstream, but now your body's in like reaction mode and it's not absorbing the vitamins and minerals you need to keep your immune system healthy. So this is like vicious cycle of inflammation. So when we're talking about food sensitivity, actually, first, let me say this. I want to make sure you know there's a difference between a food sensitivity and an allergy, okay? It's estimated that about 80% of Americans have some sort of food sensitivity or intolerance. 80%, that's a lot. That's a lot. But this doesn't mean you have an allergy. It's not the same thing. Intolerances are very different, and most intolerances can be overcome by certain protocols, okay? Now, if you allow certain intolerances to go on over a long period of time, this is what leads to things like all kinds of GI disorders, right? We're talking about, irritable bowel syndrome, Crohn's disease, colitis, and again, autoimmune disorders, right? This can lead to that, just chronic inflammation. So when you're looking at a food sensitivity, it's a different reaction from a food allergy, okay? So food sensitivity is regulated by an IgG antibody. So these are antibodies are what's sent out like, alert, alert, fight off the invader, okay? Food sensitivities are regulated by IgG. If you have an allergy, it creates an IgE antibody. Two different antibodies, two different responses. At this point in time, there is no cure for food allergies for this IgE antibody. And this is like when people have really severe reactions, like, they go into anaphylaxis, or like if you have celiac, like it literally destroys your insides, right? So this is a pretty serious thing. For this IgG response of a food sensitivity, these reactions are much more common and tend to be milder and often delayed. Like if you have an allergy, it's going to be like an automatic thing. If it's a food sensitivity, it can be delayed. So, and this is what makes it kind of hard to figure out exactly what it is, because you're like, well, I ate all these things yesterday. Which one was it, right? It doesn't show up until later. So it's when you were consistently eating foods that cause you issues. When I say issues, headaches, brain fog, stomach ache, diarrhea, constipation, hives, like some people even have flu-like symptoms. All of those are symptoms of like a food sensitivity, right? So when you're consistently eating foods that cause that to happen, this is kind of what causes this breakdown, right? It's causing this breakdown in your gut, and this immune, like the immune, what am I trying to say? The connection between like your gut and your immune system, right? So it's breaking down your immune system because your body's constantly having to fight it off, because it's like, well, there's something in here that I don't like, or something in here that's causing something weird to go on. And so your body is in this response of like trying to stop it, right? So it's more and more stress that your body has to undergo to be able to fight off what it sees as an invader, right? Now, the food sensitivity is treatable. Like you can treat a food sensitivity. And a lot of times it's just a matter of getting rid of it for a while, healing your body, and then you can incorporate it back in. If you can eliminate exposure to it for a long enough time, you basically kind of like desensitize yourself to it, right? And you can reintroduce it later without negative reactions. And a lot of times too, you're already dealing with leaky gut and you're eating this food. It's just a matter of like, okay, well, let's heal the gut first, right? So, when we're talking about specific foods that could lead to things like leaky gut, because that's kind of the end result, right? And I'm not saying that's like every case of leaky gut is because of food sensitivities, but the majority of the time there's something at play. Like there's some food sensitivities at play that are causing the inflammation, that are leading to the leaky gut, right? And I know gluten is a big one. We talk about gluten a lot. I talk about gluten a lot to my clients, and there's a lot going on about gluten. So let me talk about that for a second. So yes, gluten can cause a whole lot of problems for a whole lot of people, but there is not enough evidence, research at this time to say everybody should be gluten-free. There's just not. Now, do I think the majority of people should be gluten-free? There's a lot of people that should be gluten-free. I'm not saying everybody, and I'm not saying like 100%. Now, of course, if you have celiac, this is like an antibody response to gluten. You are gluten-free for the rest of your life. Like that's a fact. But it's not really the case for everybody. But I think it's important to understand the science around this, okay? And then this is my goal here, right? Like I can give you the information and you can make the best decision for you, right? That's the whole goal. Okay, so if you don't know what gluten is a protein found in wheat, okay? And it's in so many foods now, which is why I was talking about, people saying, oh, our grandparents didn't have to deal with this. And people say, they'll go, my grandparents weren't gluten-free. And here's the thing. The gluten we eat today is not the same gluten that our grandparents or great-grandparents found in their homemade bread at all, period. That's a fact. You can go look it up. It is not even close. Our conventional wheat, unless you're buying the organic non-GMO, which exists, our conventional wheat has been so genetically modified in the last 50 years. It's like a whole different animal. It's like a completely different animal. Not even close. Now, if you go to countries like Europe, where the processes that we use in the United States are legal there, the processing processes, is that how you say that? Their manufacturing processes, how you say it, the way they process their wheat, they're not allowed to use the same chemicals that we use, and so theirs is totally different. And I can say this from experience, and I've had clients who have gone over there who are completely, again, they don't have celiac, but completely intolerant to gluten, go to Europe, they eat the pizza, they eat the bread, they eat all the things, literally no response in the body at all. Okay, it's totally different. So point is, the gluten that we have now is not the same gluten in the wheat, is not the same gluten in the wheat we had 50 years ago. That being said, there are some schools of thought. Again, there's just not enough evidence for me to say like this is a fact 100%. There's not enough research. There is some research that points to that, like the way that our gluten has been gluten has been genetically modified. Like that's kind of the catalyst, one of the catalysts, not the catalyst, but one of the catalysts for this increase in, food sensitivities, gluten sensitivity. Could be true. It could be true. I don't doubt that at all. But again, there's just not enough to say like indefinitely this is what it is. But here is a fact for you. So gluten is actually a really strong trigger of zonulin in some people. Zonulin is this enzyme in the body that helps these little tight junctures that are along your mucosa barrier open and close to let things in and out. So there are studies that show that gluten can be a really strong trigger, meaning your body's releasing more zonulin, so it allows things to open up. So it's allowing more things in and it's allowing more things out. Not good. Now, there has to be a little bit of intestinal permeability because it has to allow nutrients up in your body. And it's when it's too much, that's the problem. And that's when you allow all this undigested food going out into the body, okay? There are some experts that say that no humans can completely digest gluten. Okay, that it's the undigested parts that triggers this release of zonulin, leading to high levels of it, which means more intestinal permeability. Now, the studies that are out there show that this is not true for every human. Okay, there are some animal studies, but again, we can't relate everything to animals and humans. We're not rats, we're not mice, we're not pigs. So you can't say it's true across the board. There's evidence, yes, but I just can't say it's indefinitely true. There were studies done. There was a study in Italy, I think it was Italy, that measured these 4 different groups of people. There was those with celiac, those with IBS, those with, like, they self-diagnosed themselves as gluten sensitive, and then there was just healthy people. And so it did show that those that had celiac and those that had labeled themselves as gluten sensitive had higher levels of zonulin in their blood than those that didn't. So the healthy people did not, which shows that it's not everybody, right? It's people who already are leaning that way. They either, have some sort of risk factor, which is a lot of times is a genetic thing with the celiac and stuff, or they are already are moving that direction that have these effects with the zonulin. It wasn't everybody. The healthy people, their levels of zonulin didn't hardly even changed. So my point is that there are mixed views about gluten. I'm not here to tell you that everybody should be gluten. Now, do I think we should eat less gluten? 100%. Everybody should probably be eating less gluten. My household is not 100% gluten-free. Do I make gluten-free stuff? Totally. But I still, we love sourdough bread. And, so there's things where it's like, okay, I'm going to kind of pick the healthier version. I'm not going to go and buy a loaf of Wonder Bread and, feed them. No judgment. I'm just saying I'm not going to do it. But the point is that there's just no blanket statement for everybody. That being said, I want to relate this to autoimmune disease. I believe, and this is me in dealing with my clients, this is me studying research and all that in my studies, I do believe because people with autoimmune diseases already have a heightened immune response, gluten-free is crucial. I said it, right? I said it. I do think gluten-free is crucial. Now, with my clients who have hypothyroidism, Hashimoto's, or Graves', 100% you're going gluten-free because the receptor in your cell for gluten and the receptor for thyroid are similar. And so your body gets confused and this can cause a huge reaction in the body. But just in general, those who have an autoimmune disease, you should be gluten-free. I do believe that because there is just too much already. I think the number, I've seen multiple studies. The number was I want to say it was 75 to 90% of autoimmune diseases are caused by leaky gut. And because we know that if you already have a propensity to an autoimmune response or an immune response, not autoimmune, just an immune response to things, the gluten it's just one thing that you can take out that lessens the risk. You know what I mean? So yeah, I'm going to tell you, I think you should be gluten free. Now, there are other things that lead to leaky gut besides gluten. It's not just gluten. I don't want to demonize gluten for, about everything, but an unhealthy diet in general, right? Stress, of course. Stress alters the gut brain interaction, right? Leads to all kinds of GI issues, increases intestinal permeability, excessive or overuse of NSAIDs, right? That's non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs like ibuprofen. Those do increase intestinal permeability. And there's studies that's like a fact, those do. So using those a lot, chronic inflammation, poor gut flora. So basically just like, an imbalance of good and bad gut bacteria, it's going to be harmful to the lining of the gut. Zinc and there's minerals too. We'll talk about mineral deficiencies here in a second, but a lack of zinc can actually alter the intestinal permeability. And then yeast. And overgrowth of yeast, mainly candida, when that gets out of hand, this can cause a lot of things to go wrong in the gut. Okay, moving on to next. Sorry, I was long-winded on that one, but I had a lot to say about it. So moving on to the next one is chronic infections or chronic viral infections. So you're exposed to a lot of viruses throughout your life. There's the flu, the chicken pox, there's HPV, there's mono, like all the big ones that we hear about a lot. Once you contract these, they stay with you for the rest of your life, basically going in and out of dormant states. A little scary, right? I'm not here to fearmonger. It's just a fact. So chicken pox, for example, right? Chicken pox stays in your body. You get the chicken pox, you have the symptoms, and then it's gone. And then the symptoms are gone, but it's dormant in your body, right? And it basically lives like in your nerves. As you age, it can show up again as shingles. You've probably seen the commercials for the shingles vaccine and all that, right? It can show up as shingles. A lot of researchers have suspected that there is a link between viruses to the development of autoimmune disorders. Some people in my FDN training are Reed Davis is the head of FDN, and he calls it the sicker quicker type. Some people they just get sicker quicker. They really do. Some people are less resilient. And some people can just better tolerate viruses than other people. If you're somebody who doesn't tolerate viruses very well, then your immune system is, it's somewhat compromised. And that can trigger like this hyperimmune states in your body, leading to autoimmune issues, autoimmune dysfunction, right? This can also be the same with infections from bacteria and parasites and fungi. Like it's all of these things that can trigger autoimmune diseases. And I can tell you with my clients, every single client I've ever had that has an autoimmune issue, they have parasites. Like we find them in their labs, they do. So these things can weaken your immune system, weaken the body, cause inflammation, and just kind of exacerbate the situation. Now, I also want to talk about toxicity. And I'm I guess specifically talking about like environmental toxins, right? Now, we are inundated with toxins day in, day out, all day long. The air we breathe, the water we drink, the food we eat, everything. You can't avoid all of them. Now, we can do our best to avoid as much as possible. You can't avoid all of them. Now, there are things like mercury and pesticides and aspartame and silica and lead. All of these can be really, really harmful to the body. So there's a study that shows that we humans, actually, I think this is specifically Americans, so I can't speak for globally. We're saturated with more than 400 toxic chemicals, like a day. And babies are born with an average of 287 chemicals in their umbilical cord. That blew my mind. 287 in their umbilical cord. So suffice to say, we are inundated with chemicals, right? We can't avoid it. Now, of course, yes, our bodies do have the capability to detoxify themselves. But when you're inundated with these day in, day out, they accumulate, right? They accumulate in the body, especially when there's other things going on in the body that like prevents your detoxification pathways to be working efficiently and effectively, okay? And this leads to a whole bunch of problems, leaky gut, inflammation, and autoimmune disease, right? So there are ways we can, minimize that, or at least like mitigate it, right? Like the toxins in your self-care products and your cosmetics and your cleaning products, like all these things we can do. And I'll talk about a little bit a second, just when talk about in general what to do about autoimmunity. But there are things that we can do to help limit this toxicity on the body. Okay. The last thing here, the last piece is nutrient deficiencies. Nutrient deficiencies affecting autoimmunity. Now, I talk about minerals a lot because it's really important and because, this is a big thing that I test in the labs that I run with my clients. So your minerals are the spark plugs in the body, right? And vitamins they're like the assistants. I don't want to say they're less important because they work together. Vitamins and minerals work together. And they play a really important role in immune function, right? Which means that when they're deficient, when they're not absorbed, then it's going to lead to immune dysfunction, right? There are so many important ones, like the fat soluble vitamins, especially like A, D, K. There's the omega-3s, there's iron and zinc and magnesium and selenium. All of those are important. Now, it's not so easy to say like, oh, well, just take a supplement with all of those in it. That'll fix it. It's not that simple because you have to know what's going on in your body, right? Which is why, and you can go back and look at previous episodes where I talked about the HTMA, the hair tissue mineral analysis. You do a test to see what's going on. So you're not just like throwing a bunch of supplements at it and you're not really addressing what the real deficiencies are, right? So here's the other piece that's important, especially if you're going like conventional medicine route. Just keep it in mind. Keep it in mind. There is a stark difference between normal and optimal levels of any nutrient. So if you take vitamin D as an example, vitamin D is a big one because everybody's talking about it during COVID. Like the people who experienced some of the roughest bouts of COVID were low in vitamin D, right? And it's something that we, is tested a lot and it's deficient in a lot of people. So researchers are going to use data based on testing of like thousands of people, right? So they test the population for vitamin D levels and they test thousands of people and then it's charted. The researchers are going to use that data to determine the quote unquote normal level of D across the population. What's normal? Okay. This means that vitamin D normal levels, quote, normal levels. This is like minimal, basically, is what it's saying. And so, like, for example, if you want to use numbers, so if you looked at these numbers, like what researchers have said, they think that the results that they got in these, when they're charting these people, that vitamin D concentrations in the 30s would be normal. But the research shows that optimal levels should be between 50 and 75. So again, normal and optimal are not the same thing, which is why when you're looking at like, quote, normal levels of basically anything in the conventional medical world, it doesn't mean optimal. It's like when you look at, and you can go, I have an episode coming out that I'm really excited about where we talk about the difference between health and vitality. I have this great interview. You're going to love it. But it's like health, literally the definition of health is the absence of disease. Like, I'm sorry. Like, I don't want to just not be sick. Like, I want to be like, have the vitality and like, you know what I mean? Like, it's not just about being healthy. It's like these levels. And I say that because these levels of like normal or whatever, they're not optimal. This is just like basically like have this level so you're not dying. And I'm not saying that to be dramatic, but there are some levels of some metrics that are used when you're getting like blood labs and stuff. It's like, oh, well, as long as it's not below this, then you're fine. Yeah, it means I'm not dying. It doesn't mean it's great. It doesn't mean it's optimal. It doesn't mean I'm functioning optimally. So when you're getting functional labs done, that's the main difference here. I know I'm going off on a tangent, but that's the main difference. We're looking at like functional levels. These are optimal levels. This isn't like, oh, you're just not dying or you're just not sick. These are optimal levels, right? It means that you're able to live optimally. You're able to live with vitality and not be sick, So off my soapbox. So what do we do about all of this in terms of autoimmunity? Getting back on topic here. So how do we address all of this? Well, first, we can address the environmental stuff, right? The toxins, the environmental, the stresses, all of that. Because we can, test for these things. We can get tests and we can see if we're harboring heavy metals, and we can buy food with that, doesn't use pesticides, and we can eat out of things that aren't plastic, right? We can help ourselves out with those things. We can run tests to check for gut infections, right? And see if there's parasites, if there's hidden infections, right? We can deal with those. You can eliminate gluten. Again, if you have an autoimmune disease, I'm telling you, go gluten-free. You can eliminate other trigger foods. Eating a lot of nutrient-dense foods, right? A lot of healthy fats, and eating the anti-inflammatory oils like olive oil and avocado oil, and getting all the omegas from wild-caught fish and nuts and seeds, and eliminating refined foods, right? Processed foods, artificial sweeteners, refined sugar, all of that. Reducing stress, getting sleep. That 7 to 9 hours is crucial, y'all. If you can't sleep, do the things, right? Go back and listen to my episode about sleep. Do all the things. The sleep is important. Removing heavy metals. Again, you really should get tested so that you're not just like guessing, but there are ways to get rid of it, and a ways to limit it. Like your cookware, your toothpaste, what you're cooking on, your cooking surface, your cooking utensils, all those things. Cleaning out your environment with your cosmetics and your skincare products, your cleaning products, all of those things. Managing, regulating your nervous system, building some resiliency in your nervous system, building in mindfulness to help with stress. Like all of these are things. And I know these are very like generic things, but this is what it takes. This is it. This is it. And I think most importantly, not most importantly, but very important, up at the top of the list, is doing the labs, getting the labs, and understanding really what's going on in your body, so you really know what you're working towards. Like, yes, obviously we want to manage symptoms, but when you aren't exactly sure, what your mineral levels are, and the heavy metal toxicity, and if there's hidden infections and parasites, all those things, like you got to have labs to know to be able to deal with that. So you can do all these others, the diet stuff and the mindfulness stuff and the stress and the sleep and all that. You can do all that, but being able to specifically target these other things are going to take some labs and take some testing. So I highly recommend finding a functional practitioner, whether it's myself or somebody else, to do the labs to understand exactly what's going on, and being able to incorporate that with all of these other kind of general healthy habits to really help with autoimmunity and to help manage the symptoms. And if anybody is telling you that you have to live with your symptoms the rest of your life, they're not telling you the truth. I'm just telling you. I'm not saying it's going to be easy. I'm not saying it's going to be quick. I'm not saying it's going to be simple, because a lot of times it's complex and it can be complicated and it can be a long road, because there's layers and layers of hidden things that we don't know about that we have to uncover when you're, working towards healing. But it's possible. It's always possible. So I hope this gave you some good insight into autoimmunity, all the ins and outs, the whys, the how to help, all the things. So I hope this helps you, or send it to a friend. If you have a friend that's dealing with an autoimmune disease, send this to a friend. Give them some hope, because I know in the world of autoimmunity, it can typically feel pretty hopeless, because that's just kind of the stigma around it, right? And it's not. So I hope this helps, and I'll see y'all next time. Thanks for listening to Hopeful and Wholesome, y'all. If you found value in this week's episode, please subscribe on iTunes or wherever you listen to your podcast, and leave a review to let me know what you thought. I'd love to know what you find useful in these episodes, so I can know how to provide the most value I can to my listeners. And if you have topics you'd like to know more about, I'd love to hear those as well. So shoot me a message on Instagram, Facebook, or LinkedIn. It's @TheHopePedraza, or you can visit my website, hopefulandwholesome.com. Thanks, y'all.